What's up guys? Today I'm going to break down the steps to building balance and show you all an example as we go along. I've broken the process down into 5 distinct steps. I'll be using OU as an example throughout this process, but these steps can be applied to nearly every singles format in competitive Pokemon. Also, the replays I show as background footage is the example team I built being tested on the ladder. Let's get right into it. Step 1. Pick a viable Pokemon or core to build around, and since this is a guide to balance, make sure the Pokemon fits on a balanced team. Let's address viability first, since that's simpler. What I mean by viability is, can it work well in top-level competitive play? Finding out if a Pokemon or particular set on the Pokemon is viable or not is usually quite easy. Something like Choice Specs Kyurem in OU is obviously viable as it sees a ton of usage. Something like Basculin in OU is obviously not viable. It's outclassed by so many stronger water types. Sometimes it's a bit harder to tell though. Is Blaziken viable? Probably. Is Comfey viable? Maybe. If you're using a lower tier Pokemon, it may be a bit more difficult to determine. If you are wondering if a Pokemon is viable or not, I advise placing it over a Pokemon with a similar role on a known successful team. If it's absolutely awful when testing on ladder, don't try to build around it, but if it seems alright or actually does surprisingly well, continue with the building process. Also, if you do decide to build around something unviable, suppose it's your favorite Pokemon or something, that's totally okay. The steps of building around Furret would be the same as the steps building around Kingambit. However bad the Pokemon, the process to reach an optimal balanced team is the same. Now let's address what fits on a balanced team and what doesn't. Although no rules in team building are truly 100%, there are some Pokemon that should almost never be on a balanced team. This mostly involves extremely passive Pokemon like Dondozo, hit-or-miss Pokemon like a Booster Energy Ironmoth, or Pokemon that are meant to die like Roaring Moon. These are all terrible on balanced teams. The problem with a passive Pokemon like Dondozo is that it lets in a lot of powerful things. If your opponent decides to switch a Choice Specs Raging Bolt on a Dondozo, there's not much you can do. If your Dondozo needs to use Rest and Heal, where are you going to find the turns to wake up? You might have enough time if you are running a full stall, but balanced teams need to move faster and likely can't afford the loss of momentum and turns it would take to let Dondozo wake up. Now, why can't you run a hit-or-miss Pokemon like Booster Energy Ironmoth? Well, it's in the name. What if it misses? Balanced teams are all about consistency, each Pokemon having a role to play in the game. You have bulkier Pokemon and pivots that enable more offensive Pokemon. If one Pokemon on your team does something only 50% of games, you're basically playing with a 5 Pokemon team the majority of the time. Now, this is no problem if you're running a hyper offense. The entire idea of hyper offense is to use a lot of inconsistent but threatening Pokemon to overwhelm your opponent. On a balance though, having something as unreliable as Booster Energy Ironmoth is a bad idea. And lastly, the problem with Pokemon that are meant to die, like Roaring Moon, is simply that they won't be around after they enter once. A great balance has carefully placed Pokemon with certain roles to create a cohesive team, and although you will certainly have to let Pokemon die in practice, having a Pokemon that is meant to die on its first entry, game after game, is going to leave the rest of your team unsupported. Especially in Generation 9, you can't afford not to make the most of your 6 slots. Note that avoiding passive, hit-or-miss, or meant-to-die Pokemon will apply to the entire team, not just the Pokemon you decide to build around, so keep that in mind as we continue. Now, with all that in mind, the Pokemon I decided to build around for my example is Choice Specs Iron Valiant. I love spamming high base power moves like Moonblast with no immunities and 100% accuracy, so I thought it would be fun to make a team around it. Step 2. Identify the best Pokemon to support your initial core. Notice how I didn't say, pick a good Pokemon that works well. I said the best. After selecting your initial Pokemon, this is the place in the team building process where you have the most freedom. Eventually, you're going to have to add stuff like Hazard Control, Fast Pokemon, a Kyurem switch-in, a Wellspring switch-in, make sure you have an answer to Gouging Fire, and so much more. Team building in Generation 9 is difficult and there are a ton of threats to answer. This will probably be the only step where you can add Pokemon that perfectly complements your initial Pokemon, before your choices are, if not controlled, at least heavily influenced by the tornado of threats in the metagame. Take your time, test various partners, look into lower tiers, and make sure you find a partner you're happy with. You also want to make sure you're thinking offensively. What I mean by that is you're focused on developing a breaking core rather than covering your chosen Pokemon's defensive weaknesses. A breaking core is a group of Pokemon that, with minimal support from other team members, are completely or nearly unwallable long term. A good example of this is Choice Band Hoopa Unbound plus Galarian Slowking. Given enough time, this core can break any team. Another example would be Gholdengo plus Meowscarada plus Hazard Stack. With full hazards up and Gholdengo to make sure they aren't removed, Meowscarada is nearly unwallable long term. Now, don't mistake thinking offensively for adding offensive Pokemon. You may add offensive Pokemon sometimes, but other times you need a bulky Pokemon to develop an effective breaking core. Let's use this example from earlier, Choice Band Hoopa Unbound. This can break anything on its own given enough time. You really don't need another Pokemon to punch holes. However, Hoopa Unbound does struggle greatly with entering the field due to its terrible physical bulk and middling speed. So, to develop your breaking core, you want to add on a Galarian Slowking. This is the best slow pivot in the tier, and it can safely bring Hoopa in with chilly reception. You see how I was thinking offensively and yet I added on a bulky Pokemon? Developing a breaking core is extremely difficult to do when also accounting for all the threats your team will have to answer defensively, so you want to develop it as soon as possible in the team building process. You might ask, is it really necessary to develop a breaking core immediately? Couldn't you create a solid defensive core first, then add a breaking core later? In theory, yes, but in practice this is very difficult to do and it often won't work out. Imagine you have 4 Pokemon on a team and you notice you're weak to Ice, Ghost, and Fairy types. It's alright though, you've got 2 slots left and you can still cover this weakness. Maybe add on a Kingambit, that helps with 2 of them. But what if you also need to develop a breaking core? Then this becomes very difficult and there probably won't be an option that will fit, forcing you to rebuild. There will always be defensive holes to patch up at the end of the team building process, so leaving a breaking core till the end is often a bad idea. If all you're worried about is covering up weaknesses, there are typically many Pokemon that could do the job. But when it comes to creating an effective breaking core, there will typically only be 1 or 2 specific Pokemon that work extremely well with your initial core, and leaving it to the end might make fitting that Pokemon impossible. You want your final team to be able to break Stall. That's the ultimate measurement. If it can break Stall, it can break anything. For my Choice Specs Iron Valiant, I decided to pair it with a specially defensive Gliscor. Given enough time, Choice Specs Iron Valiant can break pretty much anything, but it needs a safe entrance and hazards to help it out. A slow pivot U-turn Gliscor gave me a hazard setter and a way to get Valiant in. Furthermore, Slowking, Galar, and Heatran, some of the only Pokemon in the tier that can take a Choice Specs Moonblast, are shut down by Gliscor, allowing me to switch in, threaten with the knockoff, pivot out, and bring in Iron Valiant again. This seemed like a strong partner on many levels, and gave me a great start toward developing my breaking core. Step 3. Add supporting Pokemon that provide team requirements and work well with the original core. This is the most awkward stage of building by far. You've added 2 or 3 Pokemon by now, and you don't have the freedom of the early stages nor the constraints of the later stages. You can't just add whatever you want, but it won't be obvious what you need either. I would recommend using this middle stage to tackle some of the basic team requirements that you'll absolutely need. You know you'll need something like Hazard Control, a fast Pokemon, a Stealth Rock setter, something to take a knockoff, an Electric immunity, and something that can handle Salt Cure. Whichever of these aren't handled by your initial core should be addressed now. It's also important to remember that this Pokemon should work well with your initial core and fit the central goal of the team. If you're making a hazard stack, make sure you're putting things that either take advantage of hazards, set hazards, or spin block. If you're building a Sun team, make sure you're packing in as many Sun abusers as possible. Don't fall into the trap of letting team building become a checklist. If all you're doing is checking off boxes, making sure you have something fast, something to take Assault Cure, an Electric Immunity, and so on, you're going to end up making a lot of mediocre teams with Pokemon that lack meaningful synergy. Always, always make sure what you add onto the team works well with what's already on the team. Due to the general awkwardness of this step, you may have several ideas about what to add. If you do, just create multiple versions of the team in the builder and develop them independently. I often have over 10 versions with the same initial core, and they often branch out in the middle and later stages of building. Having multiple versions will keep you flexible, and through testing on the ladder, you can determine which one is best, or which pieces of each version work best. On my Iron Valiant team, I decided to add a Great Tusk next, since I knew I would need removal so Iron Valiant could enter the field many times against bulkier teams. This also gave me an answer to Calm Mind Raging Bolt, a major threat to consider when building. My slow pivoting Gliscor is outsped by most Raging Bolt and too weak to deal meaningful damage, but Great Tusk's Headlong Rush takes care of that issue. It also gave me a Stealth Rocker, allowing me to run spikes on Gliscor and create a nice Hazard Core. I knew I'd need to add something on my team faster than Iron Valiant at some point, otherwise my team would get smoked by fast threats like Darkrai and Meowscarada. Since I had a Hazard Stat Core as well, I settled on Dragapult since it provided necessary speed and a spin blocker in one slot. Before we continue, please remember to subscribe. A recent Caterpie infestation went out of control, and I regret to inform you that they have evolved into Metapod. I'm sending out teams of Skarmory to whirlwind these pests away, but I only have sufficient funds to cover my subscribers. If you haven't subscribed yet, you'll have to handle the infestation on your own. Step 4. Review basic team requirements and look over the tier, checking for what your team might lose to. Add Pokemon that fix these issues. By now, you have 4 or 5 Pokemon added to your team, so it's a good time to just scroll through OU, look at every Pokemon, and see if you have a way to handle it. If the answer is no, or if you'd like more against it, write the threat's name down. Once you've gone through the tier, try to find 1 or 2 Pokemon that finish your team, cover these threats, and work well with the rest of your team. Make sure to look in lower tiers as well. You might find exactly what you're looking for in BL, UU, or lower. It might also be that there's no way to complete your team. It's possible that no 1 or 2 Pokemon could possibly cover all the weaknesses your team has. If this is the case, try deleting some Pokemon from your team and explore alternative options that cover more threats. It's possible that your starting core is just unsupportable as well. Trying to build a balanced team in Gen 9 with 2 or more Pokemon with little defensive utility is almost certain to end in failure. If you notice that during this process your team ended up a bit bulkier or a bit more offensive than you originally intended, don't worry. I often build balanced teams that end up looking like offense teams or seem more like bulky balance or even semi-stall at times. As long as you don't stray across the lines of stall or hyper offense, you'll be fine. For more information on playstyles, check out my video on playstyles in the description. On my Iron Valiant team, I realized I was extremely weak on the special side. All I had was specially defensive Gliscor, which wasn't incredibly bulky. I was also extraordinarily weak to Kyurem and the Ice type in general. I decided to finish my team with Galarian Slowking and Kingambit. Galarian Slowking gave me an additional pivot to help bring in Iron Valiant, and a wall to scout Kyurem. Kingambit gave me an Ice Resist, Ghost Resist, and priority to help limit threatening sweepers. Step 5. Test and adjust. Take your team on the ladder and see how it performs. However good or bad your team looked in theory, actual games are the ultimate decider of whether your team is good or not. Playing the team on the ladder will help you identify threats, strong points, weak points, and help guide you toward potential changes. Try out different versions, replace things that aren't working, and accept that you're probably going to have to go back to previous steps in the process. The team building process is iterative, and you may cycle through it a few times before getting a product you're happy with. In my testing, I quickly realized that my team was extremely weak to Great Tusk. Headlong Rush and Ice Spin are either one-shot or two-shot my entire team except for my own Great Tusk. This is an unacceptable weakness. However, my team did perform better against Kyurem than I expected. I was able to threaten it offensively, and Slowking was mostly satisfactory as a special wall. Furthermore, I wasn't struggling against Dragapult or Gholdengo at all. Especially defensive Gliscor, Great Tusk, Slowking, and Iron Valiant all helped against these ghosts. I figured it might be okay to give up Kingambit, my Ghost and Ice Resist, in favor of Corviknight. This would give me a more solid answer to physical sweepers with an Iron Defense Body Press set, and it would give me a reliable switch into Great Tusk. After this change, I got destroyed by an Iron Moth. I couldn't do much with Slowking since Iron Moth could always substitute on the future site, and with a bit of luck, it could easily steamroll my team with Fiery Dance boosts. Especially defensive Gliscor wasn't effective since I was running Knockoff, U-Turn, Protect, and Spikes. I didn't want to give up Spikes since the Hazard Stack element to my team had been very effective, but I didn't want to lose any of my other moves either. I ended up deciding to replace Corviknight for a Spikes Skarmory and giving Gliscor Earthquake over Spikes, solving my Iron Moth problem. After this, the team consistently tested well and gained elo on ladder. After touching up some EV spreads and changing a few Terra types, I declared the team finished, at least for now. If you'd like to try my Specs Iron Valiant team for yourself, the Pokepaste is in the description. Also, I made a video on common team building mistakes in Gen 9. If you notice yourself having consistent issues with many of the balanced teams you build, you may want to check those videos out and see what you may be doing wrong. Before I wrap this video up, I want to let you all know that I'm accepting viewer submissions for my next Fixing My Viewers' Teams video. If you want your team to be criticized and fixed, please leave the Showdown Importable in the comments section. Good luck building your own teams, and I'll see you guys next time.